Hello, and welcome to day 2 of the Symposium to address the effects of COVID-19 on artisanal and small-scale miners. Yesterday, we had a really exciting session featuring 5 specific actionable initiatives to assist ASMs in the colored gem supply chain. If you're wondering, what can I do right now? And that seems to be what everybody's asking. Yesterday's event answered some of that question for you. Some of the most special people in the world are people who act and who inspire other people to act. And that was what we had in our session yesterday. And so it was really exciting to be part of. Today, we're going to build on yesterday's session by learning about global efforts to build global focus on creating responsible supply chains. The jewelry industry is behind in this regard. We still have a lot of work to do. And the fact that source communities around the world are suffering disproportionately from COVID-19 is due in large part to the fact that we have not achieved enough in pursuit of responsible mineral supply chains. So today we are going to have 3 experts at the global initiatives level talk with each other and us about initiatives that are being launched and that we can need to know about and can contribute to in our own ways to achieve these important goals long past the point when the crisis is over. We are joined today by Dr. Rachel Perk. She is a senior mining specialist in the extractive industries practice for the World Bank. She has lived and worked in the Horn and in Central Africa, working to manage transitions from conflict to peace, with special emphasis on mining development and reform programs in the DRC. Her PhD was on the formalization of the ASM sector in Rwanda. So we have a lot of knowledge here in Dr. Perks. Ben Katz is a policy analyst working on due diligence in the mineral supply chains at the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct. The OECD has put out a call to action for responsible mineral supply chains in the time of COVID-19, and we'll be hearing more about that today. And Cristina Villegas is a mining and rural development specialist for the NGO PACT. She is focused on mining practices and works with all scales and types of mineral producers, from LSMs to ASMs. She has been the driving force behind PACT's many collaborations with the jewel industry organizations, and she's the co-founder of the Moyo Gems Mine to Market project. So welcome, Rachel, Cristina, and Ben. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
This whole symposium was dreamed up by Susan Wheeler, who is the founder of the nonprofit Responsible Jewelry Transformative, which produces the Chicago Responsible Jewelry Conference. So I'd like to thank Susan for putting all of this together. And now I'd like to kick it off to Rachel to discuss the impacts being reported through your work and the Delve platform and some of the data analysis that they're doing that will lead to more effective action.
Great. Thanks, Andrea, and thank you again, Susan, for the invitation to be here today, and hello to everyone. For those of you who are maybe less familiar with the type of work we do at the World Bank, when it comes to the mining sector and artisanal mining in particular, our principal form of technical assistance are these large lending operations that we negotiate and deliver with government clients all over the world. And in most of our operations worldwide, we have either a very strong component on artisanal mining formalization, or some of our projects, like for instance in the Central African Republic or in Niger, are solely dedicated to artisanal mining and focus on formalization efforts there. So we have a very deep and long experience working in the sector with governments, and of course our networks are quite vast. At the same time, as most of you know, the World Bank's mission is really to be a data-driven organization and to make good policy decisions based on best data available. And so in 2016, PACT, Cristina, who's here, and the World Bank launched a new data drive initiative called Delve, focusing specifically on the artisanal mining sector. And I invite you to go to our website, delvedatabase.org. The principal mission of Delve is to essentially shed the light on artisanal mining's contribution to global development, principally looking through the lens of the SDGs, one of our flagship outputs of the website, Delve, is an annual State of the Sector report. This year we'll be focusing on decent work and economic growth. And I invite everyone to sort of stay tuned to that. There's information on the website about that. We, just like many of you who are on this call, started receiving either anecdotal messages, Twitters, emails, phone calls, WhatsApps from all of our networks around the world when COVID started hitting some of the more far-reaching areas in the developing world where we have a lot of our work going. And to be honest, it was very difficult to know what to do with that information, principally because some of it seemed contradictory, and some of it we just really weren't quite too sure how wide the impacts were, in fact. And so we managed to gather some funding that was available in our department to be able to launch principally two things. One was a working group that is convened by Delve. We meet bi-weekly and bringing actors together just to talk about the impacts and observations, what people are seeing or hearing from their networks in various artisanal mining sites all over the world. From that, we started recording then. This is going to your question, Andrea, essentially recording what we were hearing. And all of this can be found on our site. But it principally comes down to two levels of impacts. I mean, one is the restrictions that have been put in place in countries, which I think are the most difficult right now for artisanal mining communities, because movement has been constricted, transport has been constricted, flights in some cases have been constricted. And as we know, many of the places where our partners are operating, these are global supply chains that rely on expedient movement of goods in order to stay alive. So there were some very deep impacts that are happening as a result of government measures to try to isolate and contain COVID in their countries. The second level, of course, is when COVID is actually entering in a community. And to be honest, we haven't had many reports of that to date. And that is in part because there are these restrictions on travel, but then also principally because perhaps there has been no transmission of COVID in some of these places because they are very rural. So in order to try to better understand now what is happening, we have launched a data collection initiative. It will commence probably next week. Our first partners already started on the ground. We have 20 countries that are targeted, everywhere from Latin South America all the way to Asia, with 15 data collection partners, including some contacts which Susan has shared with us here. The idea is that we're going to collect data on the impacts of COVID in artisanal mining sites for the next 3 months to create monthly snapshots of what is happening so that we can monitor progress over these next 3 months. And these snapshots are going to be made available on the Delve site. Every country will have its own COVID profile, and the partners will be contributing the data, and we will be analyzing it and representing a lot of the statistics with infographics. The purpose here is really to promote good information. And the questions, we've developed a short form survey, which will be available on the site as of Monday. People will be welcome to use it, even if they don't want to participate officially in the data collection exercise. But the questions are trying to arrive at a number of things: understanding security, understanding food security, understanding the needs that people have, understanding how the supply chains have been affected, understanding how gender and women's participation in the sector has been affected, so that we can already start to be informing all of our key donors about what our responses should be in the medium term. Meaning going away from this humanitarian sort of phase where many people are already acting, to thinking already about resilience and recovery and what will be the top priorities, so that we can start sharing those messages with our donors, and hopefully other people would be able to do the same. The data collection exercise is open to anyone. As I said, it will run for the next 3 months until the end of July, at which point then we have already made a call to our donors to put in place a more substantive recovery fund and a lot of the data would be used for that. And again, this recovery fund will be open to any and all partner organizations for implementation. So I'll stop there, Andrea, unless you think there's something else I should elaborate on at this stage.
No, I think we can keep winding back to this as we go. Maybe next we could move over to Ben, and Ben could discuss the OECD call to action, and maybe you could also talk about some previous challenges you've seen with achieving the goals of OECD calls to action.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks, Susan, for organizing this, and everyone else on the line. I also, of course, want to thank Rachel and the World Bank for setting up Delve, and in particular this initiative to collect data during this time, because it's really key to match our initial observations with real data that's coming from the ground, because as Rachel mentioned, we do hear sometimes contradictory information, or at least information that really needs to be better tracked in a systematic way in order to inform the policy advice that we give. So as Andrea mentioned, we've recently launched a call to action related to the impacts of COVID-19 on the ASM sector. And there are many, I think, on the line here who have signed on to this call to action, but it's a call to action from the multi-stakeholder steering group of the Responsible Minerals Program of the OECD. And this has been a group and a program that's been around for the last decade, that's been stewarding the implementation of the OECD due diligence guidance on responsible mineral supply chains. So with this perspective in mind, it's a large part of the impetus for the call to action was recognizing not only the disproportionate impacts of this crisis on ASM communities, but also the real important gains that have been made in terms of due diligence and building responsible mineral supply chains the last 10 years, and being conscious of the fact that we run a real risk here of backsliding on some of those gains due to a number of factors, including the supply chain disruptions that we've seen, restrictions on movement, and the knock-on effects that this has had, in particular, on the ground due diligence programs that depend financially on production and trade in order to finance their programs. Then we also see, anecdotally, but really in a number of instances in ASM communities and markets, illicit actors, and in some cases, non-state armed groups or criminal actors, being well positioned in order to claim a larger share of the market. And this is really concerning to us, not only because it could lead to a backsliding of due diligence and responsible mineral supply chains, but also because of the adverse human rights impacts that could cause and have on ASM communities. So as part of the call to action, which spans our entire multi-stakeholder steering group, including government, civil society, and the mining and mineral trading industry, we have a few key components that we're calling for. So one is to activate humanitarian and emergency response networks in order to better reach ASM communities. So this relates to the fact that ASM communities, on the one hand, they do appear at first glance to be less affected in terms of health by the crisis. But that may also be because we have very little information. That may be because there's very little testing. And in any case, we know that they're not getting some of the key health messages, partly because of their remoteness, that they need to in order to prevent and prepare for potential outbreaks. And of course, they have been severely affected by the economic impacts of mitigation measures targeting COVID-19. And so on that basis, for that reason, we're really calling for the existing on-the-ground due diligence programs and active NGOs serving mining communities to function as avenues and to leverage those networks in order to better reach ASM communities, not only to alert them to prevention measures they need to be aware of, but also in order to support on-the-ground due diligence programs when they need it most. And similarly, we're calling for emergency funding for such programs, as well as some SMEs, some small and medium-sized enterprises in mineral supply chains, to ensure that they can continue to function, to ensure, to promote better resilience in the supply chain. But we also feel strongly about attaching conditions to that support, so that we can ensure that responsible production and trade continues, and to ensure that there are shared benefits from such emergency funding. We're also calling for the continued sustainable inclusion of responsible ASM projects. In our work in general, across different mineral supply chains, unfortunately, we've seen one dimension of market reactions to calls for due diligence and responsible sourcing has been a trend towards de-risking. So that's to avoid ASM or perceived high-risk areas altogether. And that's really not in line with the spirit of the due diligence guidance. We're really, through the due diligence guidance, we're really calling for responsible engagement and investment in high-risk areas and mitigation of identified risks. And so we're trying to amplify that, particularly in light of the disproportionate impacts on ASM communities through this call to action. We also, sorry, Andrea, did you say something?
Could just dig into that a little deeper, because this was a question that was asked on the CIBJO conference call this morning, where they asked if people thought there should be more government intervention, more consumer requirements for responsible supply chains, or industry. And I noticed a good 25% thought government had the responsibility there. And government plays a role, but could you dig in and explain, in case some people aren't entirely clear, how that kind of action can actually hurt our ASM communities? Because I'm not sure everybody always knows the impacts of that. When
how government
avoiding high-risk areas altogether.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the impacts, they certainly exist in, or at least we're particularly aware of them, for example, in gold and more recently in cobalt. Many on the call may be aware of the scrutiny the past 4 years, the heightened scrutiny of risks like child labor in the cobalt supply chain. And many companies, either as a result of this or because of prior awareness of that risk, had made a decision not to source ASM material at all. And so in the first instance, the potential effect of that is to exacerbate actually the adverse human rights impacts that companies are seeking to avoid. And so in the sense that ASM is a reality, it exists both outside and overlapping with large-scale mining. It's going to exist regardless of their efforts to avoid it in their supply chains. And by avoiding it, we make formalizing it more difficult. And then it's also, in a sense, a fiction that it's possible to, at least in the cobalt supply chain, avoid ASM altogether due to the extent of blending, due to companies that source both LSM and ASM materials. So in a lot of different respects, it's counterproductive to actually mitigating and reducing harm. And I think that that's as applicable to gemstones and other mineral supply chains as it is to cobalt and gold.
Thanks. I just think that was worth clarifying, just in case. So sorry, go ahead now.
Thanks. Yeah, and I'd also just like to mention that we did publish a report on cobalt and copper sourcing from the DRC last November called Interconnected Supply Chains. And that report discusses the unintended consequences of de-risking a great deal. So then we also, the last part of the call to action relates to balancing flexibility while with maintaining integrity of due diligence processes during this time. So of course, we're dealing with travel restrictions, logistical disruptions, which can complicate the kind of on-the-ground due diligence, particularly when it comes to risk assessments of different segments of the supply chain. So we acknowledge that there may need to be some changes to due diligence practices, but that doesn't mean that they should be of a lower quality. So as companies continue to conduct due diligence, we think it's really important for them to report on their rationale for the due diligence decisions and how they needed to adapt their practices during this time. We think that that's a good way to continue to be transparent and to maintain a high level of integrity for their due diligence practices. And then just touching on how some of our work and the call to action may apply in particular to the gemstone supply chain. While we haven't done as much work at the OECD Secretariat on gemstones as we have on, for example, copper and cobalt and 3Ts and gold. There are a lot of lessons I think we can draw on when it comes to engaging responsibly and applying due diligence to other mineral supply chains. And so I would bring up, for example, the need to build understanding among really a range of different stakeholders and industry actors, including a lot of informal workers. In the case of gemstones, as with cobalt or 3Ts and gold, a large, I think actually a majority of gemstones are produced through ASM. And so this is both a challenge and an opportunity by giving visibility to ASM and its importance to the market on the one hand, but also being able to explain and train and build capacity within the industry regarding due diligence. There can be, I think, a resistance sometimes due to a lack of familiarity with obligations to be more transparent and to disclose, particularly when it comes to sensitive issues like supply chain relationships. And then also we run into difficulty, or at least a need to really come to a shared understanding about the structure of supply chains in order to determine a control point that's appropriate for auditing and to sort of better define the relationships between upstream and downstream, so that each segment of the supply chain can conduct adequate due diligence based on the risks they face. So thank you.
Thank you. Let's turn it over to Cristina now, and then we'll come back. I'd like to see some of your questions start hitting the chat environment so that we've got questions queued up for our speakers when they're done with their overall presentation. I'd also like to encourage you speakers to engage with each other and ask questions of each other, because I think we learn a lot from you guys digging into the topics together. But Cristina, perhaps you could start talking about actions that you and other NGO practitioners are considering and what you're doing now, and give us a sense of how this starts looking in action.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I was having some technical issues. So thank you for having me. Some of you probably recognize me from different jewelry conferences, Tucson get-togethers, and it's nice to see so many familiar faces on the chat. PACT, I'm the director of mining at PACT, and as you might know, we're a very large organization. We have about 40 countries that we work in across a number of issue areas. So in addition to gemstones and gold, we work on cobalt and copper and tin, tantalum, tungsten, and diamonds and other things like that. So we are actually already responding in some cases based on our health program footprint. And this is in South Africa, in Indonesia, in Tanzania, and other places where we already have health programming. And this is working hand in hand with governments, with our local partners, to pass out accurate information to communities who might have old school phones and not smartphones, so they're getting different kinds of information. And then demonstrating social distancing and helping communities understand how this is spread. In the mining projects, we're working in copper and cobalt areas of DRC to again pass out relevant and accurate information. In gemstones, gemstones, I think a lot of people don't realize that there are hidden suppliers for the jewelry sector. So between 80 and 90% of all colored gemstones are mined by artisanal and small-scale miners, 80 to 90%. Yet we know very little about them. And PACT's gemstone work has kind of two big buckets, buckets of gems. The first is our ongoing collaboration with GIA, the Gemological Institute of America. And the second is our Moyo Gems work. And in Moyo, it's a mine-to-market collaboration with the female miners of Tanzania. And when we saw this COVID outbreak, passing around the world, we knew we just couldn't stand by. And yet PACT was not set up to do food relief and to do cash transfers and things like that. So we decided to take extraordinary measures and find partners who were set up for this. So we teamed up with Gem Legacy, which is a US NGO and based, they have a footprint in Tanzania and Kenya. And so we teamed up with them to make sure that the miners that we work with in Moyo were part of their relief efforts. That's in the short term. In the long term, we are thinking about how we can get the supply chains going again. So we've been experimenting with remote buying models, relying on our local partners, like the Tanzania Women Miners Association and others, like our Tanzania exporter, and our country office. So again, PACT has 40 country offices. They are staffed by Tanzanian nationals, and they've already taken a leadership role in the Moyo Gems program. So how can we rely on TWOMA, the Tanzania Women Miners Association, and our country offices and our exporters more if this COVID pandemic persists over the long term? We're also finding ways to strengthen our local partners. This is relying on their leadership, but also finding money for them. With associations, local associations, they're impacted in kind of invisible ways. So when there's a crisis, the miners don't have money to pay their dues. And so the associations don't have budgets to be able to respond. So it's incredibly important in normal times to support these associations because they have the global reach or the local reach that we might not. And then especially in these tough times, supporting them beyond normal project engagement. And we're also thinking about, at a higher level, working with the donors that we normally work with, like the British government, the Dutch government, the US government, our corporate donors. How can we use this time as a reflection point? How can we acknowledge the vulnerabilities that COVID has uncovered and build back better? How can we use this as a motivating force to start working on these things that we've known have been existing for a long time, these health disparities in ASM communities? And how can we mobilize our jewelry sector partners, our friends or designers that are jewelers, that are trading companies? How can we mobilize them as friends now and in the immediate term, but especially over time, using tools like the OECD due diligence guidelines, and then other more creative ways of giving back. So thank you for inviting me again, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Cristina. We already have some questions and a lively discussion about opacity and transparency going on in the chat box. Before we go into questions, I'm wondering if Rachel or Cristina or Ben have anything else they want to add to their baseline presentation before we dig in and start talking about the issues with our audience. Anything else you want to add after listening to each other?
Yeah, I guess I've seen a bit of the chat going, and thanks, Andrea, for managing that. Sometimes it's hard when you're a speaker to also be trying to follow the questions. think one point that we haven't really discussed is the role of government, and of course it's easier for us to speak to that, I think, as the World Bank, because principally governments are our clients in many respects. And I wanted to just highlight one example, for instance, of COVID response that we have been involved in at the request of the government of Central African Republic, where as a group of organizations that are already supporting in-country programs in artisanal mining. So there's the European Union or the Commission, there's ourselves as the World Bank, there's UNDP, then there's also USAID. Through our 4 sort of institutions and then our implementing partners, we have been supporting the government, the Ministry of Mines in particular, to do specific response actions for the diamond and gold areas, principally because there's a need to go beyond, I think, some of the measures that have been put in place, and also because the restrictions of movement in and out of the capital of Bangui have been so strict. We know it is inevitably leading to an increase in illicit trading of both diamonds and gold, because simply there's very little presence in the rural areas at this time. So I think it's also important to highlight that, and one thing that we've been trying to stress through our working group is that everyone is responsible, no matter what stakeholder we represent, and that a lot of in-country coordination and collaboration is really key in order to be able to provide the right types of responses. And the CAR has been, in my view, a really amazing example of that, whereas institutions, we've gotten behind the government, respecting the decisions that they are making and trying to offer, comparative advice where we know it's happening, to be able to allow them to really be in the fore of these types of responses. And I'd be curious to know, Cristina, I know there was a call from the government of DRC a while ago, whether there have been other examples like this of really allowing government to lead, right, so that we get the best sort of coordinated response that we can.
Yeah, sure. I think in some cases, governments have the capacity to lead. In other cases, they don't. And, people who I've run into before have heard me say, we all have a role to play. And, in Tanzania, we've been working hand in hand with the government to reach rural gemstone miners in the first place, and then help them formalize over time using creative ways, bridge agreements in some way, and sometimes, and in addition to the traditional license system, and other times. But I do want to kind of mention that there's some really extraordinary things happening. We have the Moyo Gems response with Gem Legacy, but then across the continent, in Sierra Leone, for example, you have the government, working, as much as it can, but you also have kind of unexpected allies in some cases stepping up. So you have the De Beers Gem Fair program. Gem Fair works with artisanal diamond miners in Sierra Leone. They have about 100 miners they work with in Kono, and they're working to distribute PPE, masks, soap, and also do food drop-offs, recognizing that, like we did, miners face hunger very quickly when the sales stop. So I wanted to give a shout out to De Beers for that. It's several months worth of response efforts, and it's been being done really thoughtfully, using radio time and all the resources that they can control in their footprint. And they don't have to do that, but they are. So I think it's a mix of different players who have a role to play, whether you're a big company like them, or a government, or an NGO like us, that is trying to serve our partners well, and responsibly, not creating dependencies. That's one thing that we're thinking about. How do we make sure to manage expectations, not get people used to free stuff, and help them over the longer term by restarting markets, because that is sustainable. So we need a mix of partners, we need a mix of approaches, I think, to move forward.
So Christina, in a conversation with you and me and Susan and Ben the other day, you said something that gave me the clearest visual in my mind. And what I ended up with is it has to be government, community, and industry, highlighted by pure transparency. And the NGOs can kind of weave through all of it and help us put it all together. That was my mental graphic. So I just thought I'd share that.
Yeah, you know, and something that Susan Wheeler mentioned the other day to me that has been kind of rolling around in my head is, you know, if we had the gemstone sector figured out, if we knew where all the supply was coming from, and we knew the miners, we wouldn't be in this mess. So how can we think about that right now, support their immediate response, and then build on that? So the amazing work that Monica Gachui and Susan Wheeler and Jessica from Jewelry Nomad are doing, along with the Federation of Zambian Miners, how, you know, in the short term, how can we build on that for the longer term to create something really special? Can we find a silver lining here? Can we motivate and catalyze these conversations about vulnerability, about the health disparities in mining communities? And build these supply chains we keep talking about but aren't doing it. So that's what I'm thinking about, is the immediate term, but also it's a moment. Let's use it to reset, and let's focus on, again, all the roles that we each play, and what we can control.
Yep, and not our focus after the crisis is over.
Correct.
Speaking of Monica Gachui, who's a partner in this project and AJEC Africa, her question was, does the OECD due diligence guideline provide a framework for LSM-ASM coexistence?
Sure, thanks, Andrea, and thanks, Monica, for the question. So there is in the due diligence guidance, there's an annex devoted to responsible engagement of ASM, and this annex, it's directed to industry actors and market actors throughout the supply chain, not only LSM, but it is applicable to that context. And our report that I mentioned earlier about cobalt and copper sourcing from the DRC, it goes a bit more into detail on the kinds of relationships that can take place between ASM and LSM, and kind of lays out a typology of them, moving from highly hostile relationships to more cooperative ones, and what that can look like in terms of commercial collaboration, in terms of risks, and the profile of risks that downstream buyers should be aware of, and the kinds of due diligence that should necessitate. And it's just worth highlighting that obviously more cooperative relationships are more conducive to formalizing ASM. And so this is something that we recognize, pulling out particular case studies from the DRC context.
That is a partial answer to Hedda's question, which is, does the OECD have an intention to engage or support the gemstone supply chain? So I can see the connection to the ASMs, but is there any particular OECD intention around gemstone sources?
At this point, I mean, we certainly intend to remain engaged via events like this, and of course, I mean, we provide policy advice to due diligence initiatives and standards for mineral supply chains around the world, and that includes the gemstone supply chain. So I would just ask that those on the line and those who are involved in programs feel free to seek out our advice. Of course, we have active projects on a number of fronts, but we definitely consider it important to stay engaged in the supply chain.
Andrea, I could just also maybe briefly mention Not sure the type of information that Monica is looking for, but in 2009, we put out a handbook, a working document on LSM, ASM relationships and how to manage those. Now, this document was really coming after almost a decade of sort of the movement of large mining, particularly into the African continent, often into areas where artisanal mining had been working informally, as we would call it, because these grounds had been laying fallow for decades after lack of investment. And large-scale industry was really struggling to figure out how, beyond policing measures, to forge fruitful, sustainable relationships with artisanal miners. And we put out that handbook in 2009. It's obviously has a lot that could be updated, but it is a basis. It provides a framework for understanding, but it is much more geared towards in places where large-scale and artisanal miners may be finding themselves in positions of coexistence on specific concessions. So I just wanted to share that with Monica.
Thank you. There is a very lively discussion going on in chat about, it was kicked off by Cristina Villegas, who asked who benefits from the lack of transparency in the colored gemstone supply chain, and why are so many people comfortable with that opacity? And we have contributions from the folks from CIBJO and different people doing jewelry industry initiatives. We're seeing answers like the profit motive. It's easier to grab profit for yourself if other people can't see what's going on in your supply chain. I can't even catch up with all of the conversation that's scrolling by. One of the things that is mentioned, and it comes up all the time when we're talking about responsible supply chains, is the role of the middlemen, the brokers around the world, and they're part of the gem supply chain structure, and people can have very impassioned opinions about that. But as Monica Stevenson pointed out, the group, the Moyo Gems project, worked within the existing system of brokers to try to create some better working relationships. And I was wondering if Cristina could speak to that for a moment, because you found a middle way that I think is very interesting.
Yeah, sure. It was really important for us not to make anyone a target and not to make anybody more vulnerable when we created the Moyo Gems program. So one thing we did was recognize the role that brokers play. In the region of Tanzania that we work in, there's no pre-financing happening on mine sites. And pre-financing is often a broker or the person above him or her will pay for equipment, will pay for meals like rice and whatever it is that day, in exchange for buying rights. And so folks will sell to that person at a discount, but it's a long-term relationship. And so I know it's easy to kind of demonize middle folks, middle men and women, but they have a role to play, and it's worked for many decades in some cases. In Moyo, we are shortening the supply chain, but we also want to make sure that we don't disrupt that relationship. So what we decided to do was ask the miners that we co-designed the program with, who are 5 to 6 brokers that you trust, who haven't run off, who have been there for you, who are responsible players in this community. And we worked with those brokers to then formalize them. I think there's 6 brokers on 1 license, but anyways, the government is working with us on that. Slowly, as they say, progressive improvement on formalization. And those brokers are part of the transactions at market day when all the miners just, come to a certain area and sell to the Moyo Gems program. They're not required to sell, but they usually do sell because we pay 95% of the export value goes to these miners. And the brokers love it because they just show up, help the miners negotiate, and they get 5% of that just by showing up. And when we're not buying, the ladies and the men who are part of the program sell to these brokers as I normally would. So we were really trying to be really careful when we designed our program. But also, I just want to make it clear that yes, in some cases that relationship can be predatory, but in so many other cases it's not. It's these long-term relationships that have been negotiated, and you know, these brokers have a role as aggregators, as financiers, as friends, and so that in terms of who's benefiting from the lack of transparency, you know, lots of people. One of the things that motivated Moyo Gems was I really wanted to show who's at the beginning of our supply chain, and also show the ladies and gentlemen that we work with where their stones go. So it's two-way transparency, and they over time get to the real prices of their goods. So it's really important to us to tell the stories of the communities, and to show that face and to educate the jeweler about where these gems come from. As a friend of mine says they don't come from Tucson. Some do, but gems come from all over the world, and we need to know more about those source communities and help build them over time to be stronger.
Well, it's also really important not to get fixated on the opacity of the supply chains down in the broker mining end, because until we have true transparency at the retail and consumer and manufacturing end of the supply chains, remember, this end of the supply chain benefits very much from that opacity. And so they're holding on to it. So as a jewelry industry, we need to commit to transparency at the consumer end of the supply chain, which will benefit the rest of the supply chain. So I don't like to be fixated on brokers and not talk about that very important point.
And I just want to say, you know, by getting to know the source communities, there's a beautiful story you can tell. You can talk about, you know, maybe in the beginning you might not have known where your stuff comes from, but then you became woke, and you started donating a portion of your sales or you know, a yearly allocation to these communities, with trusted partners, to improve conditions over time. Because anybody who follows Moyo, you know, through the Anza Gems Instagram or the Moyo Instagram or 1948, will know that we fall in love with these communities, and they're very, you know, charismatic business partners that I think can help with your sales. And help connect the consumer to you even closer when they understand how you're giving back.
Mm-hmm.
If I could add to that, on transparency, I think there tends to be a misunderstanding sometimes about what we mean in responsible sourcing and related to the due diligence guidance about transparency. The goal is not to have companies be complete open books in terms of their commercial relations without any due consideration of business confidentiality or competitive or security concerns. It's really to ensure that the due diligence practices that companies are carrying out and the management systems that support them are clearly set up, and the rationale for them and for risk identification and mitigation is explained, and to ensure that those systems are working. So it's there's some nuance there that I think sometimes it isn't clear to everyone.
Fair enough. That's a good clarifier. Yeah, everybody's afraid that means I have to tell everyone who I buy everything from. What you have to have is clear documented policies. Sarah Youde at JVC puts this out all the time. You have a plan, document it, have somebody look at it, make sure it's clear, make sure you follow it. But it doesn't necessarily mean you have to tell everybody who your competitors are or your suppliers are. Though that can be hard to negotiate sometimes, can't it? Like if, you know, we're still struggling with mechanisms for that kind of traceability that make it possible to be transparent without disclosing information. So do you guys have any insight on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes there's also, when it comes to traceability, there's a notion that, first of all, that traceability is a panacea for all kinds of concerns around human rights due diligence, which of course it's not. It is one way of establishing the factual circumstances of a supply chain and the risks that that occur throughout the supply chain. But in our guidance, what we're really looking for is transparency, and transparency can't be accomplished only through traceability. It can also be chain of custody. There are a lot of different management systems that companies can use in order to meet the expectations of the guidance. And I think that, of course, noting the challenges to perfect traceability, it's of course also important to take a risk-based approach. So it doesn't mean that every single supply chain is perfectly mapped to the mine pit, that produced every mineral in every company's supply chain. It means that they need to take a sensible, rational approach to identifying the most severe potential adverse impacts and follow up on them and establish transparency over the supply chain.
Very good.
And on the transparency front, we have a couple of examples right now that are mapping from miner to market. A clear chain of custody. So you have the De Beers GemFair program, which we're not involved with, by the way, and that they work with diamond miners in Kono. And then you also have Moyo. And part of again, part of my motivation was to show what's possible with transparency. So we can actually tell you the miner who mined that garnet or mined that sapphire. We can tell you her name. There's some things that we don't disclose, like the village, like her last name, like a lot of personal information, because those are privacy concerns, especially for vulnerable populations. But I also know that there's some folks like Columbia Gem House, who has done kind of an interesting blend where they set up sourcing relationships and ask those miners to work on certain topics that are priorities for them, and they give it a score. I think it's between 1 and 5 on perfect traceability and no traceability, and then those customers can choose what they want. But they also know that that company is engaging on those issues over time, so I really appreciate that. There's a number of ways you can show that you're doing the right thing and that you know where the gems are coming from. I think for the designers on the line, if you think your stones are traceable, ask for evidence. Don't just rely on the assurance of whoever you're buying from. Oh yes, I know. Ask for photos. Ask for what's working, what's not. Ask for details, because it's easy for someone to lie to you. It's much harder to provide evidence for those claims, and I think we should start asking for those evidence points to make sure people are doing the right thing. Someone once said, "Trust but verify," and so in this case, we need to get more folks on the verification side, and get the jewelry community to start engaging with their sources a bit better.
Well, and there's honestly way more discussion about transparency in the chat right now than we could even hope to address in this session. So I think we probably just need to have another gathering where we discuss what it means, what it doesn't mean, how to balance the needs of transparency with, not displacing miners, all of that. To wrap up this session, let's move back to a couple of questions that have come from the community about what are the messages we should convey to consumers, and how can independent jewelry designers get involved? And I'd like to end this session by talking about how can we act now to assist people at the source communities so that they can emerge from this crisis whole, so that we can finish the work of creating responsible supply chains. So what can we do now? What's actionable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'll take a first crack at that. And actually, just before that, Andrea, I did want to recognize Vineeth's point about transparency as but one element. I mean, I think this is something that's really been at the heart of certainly all of us on this call. It's one thing to have due diligence, traceability schemes, all the rest, but we know that even with all those systems in place, people are still working under very difficult conditions, and sometimes not getting the right pay for the work. Sexual violence, predation, it happens in these places. And so I would encourage us to look beyond exactly this discussion on transparency, and stay tuned for the SDG 8 report that we're putting out this year, because this is where we're highlighting the work of a lot of organizations to actually build up decent work in these sectors, and that'll be coming out probably in August, so stay tuned. When it comes to actions, I mean, I think there are a number of ways to get involved. On our working group, we have organizations similar to Susan, others who are direct buyers, who have very secure, steady supply chains with certain ASM communities, whether it's in India, Malawi, elsewhere, who are just reaching out to local government and doing action right on the ground themselves. And they're coordinating with agencies. They're making sure that they're following all the guidelines that the government has put in place. There's an amazing Mica Minerals. They've been doing a soup kitchen. They've been basically feeding miners who are now out of work right now and supporting households. So if you have already very established relationships with different artisanal mining communities, and you know how to get funds to those places, and you have people you trust, just act directly would be one first thought. The second would be looking at organizations like PACT, Impact, others, AGC, Artisanal Gold Council. There are so many people who are also, as Cristina said, working through their health programs or using their existing programs to do health outreach and measures. But again, please to be very conscious that we don't want to put people at risk. So we need to be following whatever the guidelines are in those countries about what is safe movement, what is safe practice, etc. In other instances, it might be wanting to join forces on longer term programming. And for that, you know, there's these organizations, there's the World Bank. We have facilities where we can do public-private partnerships. I mean, those are more going down the line of recovery and not so much on immediate humanitarian, but those are certainly some of the initial thoughts that come in my own mind at the moment. And in terms of direct action on the ground. And then lastly, I think it is about education. You know, take the COVID time, as awful as it might be, to really explain to people exactly where their gemstones come from and what people are being impacted by in these communities as a result of COVID. I was thinking back to that initial question that someone asked. I mean, I'm very passionate and I'm very knowledgeable, but that's because I've lived in artisanal mining communities for decades and worked in them. You know, I can't fault my neighbor next door who's never traveled outside of the US for not knowing where their, you know, diamond ring came from or their diamond in their ring came from. I think it's, again, on all of us to be educating and taking any moment we can to just share about the work that we do and the things that we know. And encourage other people to become more interested in knowing more about where they source from. So I'll stop there.
That's really good advice. Cristina, Ben, what can we do?
Sure, I'll step in. So I think there's a number of things. First, ask your suppliers, if you're a jeweler or a designer, ask your suppliers what they're doing to respond to COVID in these gem communities. And ask for evidence about what they're doing to engage with these supply chains. Are they just blindly buying from an exporter, or are they getting to know where these stones actually come from and engage on the tougher issues that exist, but that very few people are actually working on? Buy responsible stones now. These projects, the projects in gold, have shown us the way. So you have a number of opportunities such as Fair Trade, Fair Mind, Better Gold, and other outlets to support those projects in gemstones are very far, and we need to support them and show them love because it's very hard work, and we're trying to prove a point on that this community wants to engage with these communities that form the basis of our supply chains. So if you want to buy Moyle, you go to Anza Gems or 1948's website, and you can buy from them. You can give to Gem Legacy, who are continuing to do immediate humanitarian relief. You can give a portion of your sales to both immediate and longer term efforts, again through humanitarian or longer term development programs. You can plan on attending if you're a miner or if you're a trader or companies that buy directly from the field. You can plan on attending the Africa Gem and Jewelry exhibition that's happening in October. It's being run by Monica Gachui with Andrea's help and Susan Wheeler's help and others. I'm really looking forward to that. I'm planning on going. You can plan on attending the Chicago Responsible Jewelry Conference. I always go. It's easily the most substantive conference of the year, and it's always a good time too. And then you can also just engage your consumers and communicate how you're responding. So again, if you're able to buy stones now, please buy them from these programs that we know where our stuff comes from. And then, and if you're growing into that ability to buy, you can buy a few stones and then grow into that. But wouldn't it be wonderful if after COVID, this sector was much more beautiful than it is now? And I think we all have a role to play in that. So thank you.
Well, and to Rachel's point, it's time for us to be educating for all the designers on this call. If you're buying responsible gemstones from these initiatives, then taking them to your customers right now while you're working from home and say, let's design something amazing around a stone that I have a story to tell you about. That's actionable, and it helps everybody immediately, including you. So Ben, any closing act now thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, hard to follow those recommendations up. I think they're really comprehensive and exactly what we had in mind as part of the call to action. I think I'd just like to emphasize that both consumers and retailers, it's a time, I think, likely when there may be some difficult conversations with suppliers, especially as there are disruptions to supply chains and they're reconfiguring to some extent during this time. And I would say that as part of these conversations, there's obviously a need to be understanding as business is under pressure, but I think it's also a time to make sure that they're aware that the need for due diligence and engagement of responsible engagement of ASM, that it's never been more important to do that, because actually by engaging these very vulnerable communities, maintaining business, but doing so in a responsible way is really a lifeline for many of these communities. And that where changes do need to be made to sourcing practices, that suppliers can explain that, and that you work with them, that you engage with them in order to ensure that those changes are responsible, and even if they need to adapt to current circumstances and current restrictions, that there's a reason for doing so, and that they still respond to the need to maintain high levels of due diligence and risk mitigation. I think also many of you may be aware of the CRAFT standard for responsible ASM production and trade. And of course, it's in the midst of another edition. And so I think what would be good to do is to stay aware of CRAFT and when possible to apply it to your own supply chains, or encourage your suppliers to do so. So thanks so much again for including the OECD in this conversation, and look forward to staying in touch with everyone on the call.
Susan, I know you're lurking there because I see you answering questions. You want to pop in and give us a few closing thoughts, and then I'll say our goodbyes?
Oh, there I am.
There you are.
So Yeah, I really want to thank everyone for participating. My nonprofit designation officially came through just about 2 months ago for the Responsible Jewelry Transformative, to kind of encompass not just the Chicago conference, but everything I do, with the mission of transforming the jewelry industry to help further the UN SDGs through education, community, and projects. And it wasn't just hitting the ground running when COVID came, it was really all hands on deck. And the amount of work and things that I felt needed to be done and are going to continue to need to be done in our industry are a lot. So, I did put together the project page, and I really appreciate everyone that has jumped onto both of these symposiums, both to engage and to speak. Thank you, Andrea Hill, for running all of this and bringing all of these thoughts together and helping out. And also AJAC Africa, my partner with Monica Gachui. And thank you all today. Thank you so much, Cristina, for making all these connections and bringing everyone together, and Rachel and Ben. So I hope that everyone continues to stay engaged, check on Delve, see what's happening with COVID, jump onto these initiatives that we talked about yesterday, because I'm hoping that we don't have a lot of work to do all summer and to keep helping, but I'm afraid we do. So let's be a responsible jewelry industry and keep it going and keep the help going. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Again, thanks to each of our speakers for participating and contributing, and thanks to the audience for your time and all of your amazing lively discussion. We'll include the chat transcript with the follow-up material so everybody can review all the promises you made each other, because there was some good action going on there. And Susan and I have talked about doing a lot more electronic communication like this with our community. So we hope you stay tuned because we want to keep this conversation going. So get out there, do something to help somebody, and wake up every day with that intention, and we can fix some things along the way. So thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.